Hi, this is Nikhil coming to you from Chicago with the Shelley story. My wife Shelley and I wrote a book and are currently working on a movie about our journeys with mental health, specifically bipolar disorder. As an offshoot of that, we've developed a podcast called The Shelley Story, where we speak to people from a broad variety of backgrounds about diverse issues, most notably mental health. I'm very excited to speak to today's guest, Monica Kathuria. She and I have known each other, no joke, for almost 4 decades. Got a great sense of humor and incredible wealth of knowledge and experience in clinical psychology. So we're very thrilled to have her on the program. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit more about Monica's background. Monica Kathuria, PsyD, is a licensed clinical psychologist and the CEO and founder of Encircle Wellness, an established private practice located in Chicago's West Loop, which focuses on mental health and well-being. Monica has over 20 years of clinical therapy experience and is passionate about helping people build strong relationships, communicate more effectively, and become the best version of themselves. Monica works primarily with young adults, adolescents, and entrepreneurs who are struggling with relationships and communication issues, anxiety, depression, life transitions, and family of origin and cultural impact on individuals and communities. So, Monica, it's great to have you on the show. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background, adding a little bit anything to the summary that I may have provided?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to sit here and talk with you. This is I've
Yep.
been hoping to do this with you for a long time. So, in addition to what you shared, I actually was trained as a child and adolescent therapist
Hmm.
here in Chicago, and then I went to New York, and I was there for many years working with that population. But what's interesting, it's very different from the West Loop population. Um,
Sure.
this is a very low income, BIPOC, mostly Hispanic, Black population. And so I then came back to Chicago and realized that, I had learned a lot.
Hmm.
Lots of great experience with different communities and lots of challenges and different things that they were facing. So it really helped
Sure.
get a better understanding of how impactful our communities are on us as individuals.
So it sounds like you've been doing this for about 20 years. But growing up back at good old Maumee Valley back in Toledo, was there anything along the way that maybe pushed you into that direction?
It was my freshman year. I'm taking a Psych 101 class, and the information
Yeah.
was so fascinating. And I didn't realize that mental health was really this curiosity that was always there that I didn't realize until I was taking this class. And you're saying like growing up and stuff like that. I think we see things, we hear things, and there's that curiosity of like, well, we're all sort of this way. Like, why are other people behaving this way?
Sure.
Especially in our community. And I really sort of noticed, in our family, we have a difficult family member, and it was sort of like, but we're all one way. This person is so very different, and I think that person just kind of stuck with me. And it was sort of
Hmm.
like, what is going on here? So it was that curiosity about people and how they interact with each other, and how they operate.
So what would you say is like the driving philosophy when you launched Encircle Wellness, and how do you feel that's evolved over time?
So, I feel like a lot of people think when you go to therapy, it's because you have to fix a problem or
Yeah.
you're in a crisis and that's why you need to go. But I
Hmm.
think, therapy is really more about becoming the best version of yourself.
Yep.
Um, and so that's more sort of our foundation. We're all different people. Our like my best version might be different than my best friend's best version of themselves. And so,
Sure. It's all subjective.
right.
There's not a one size fits all, basically.
All. And so that's always been the foundation. I think how we've evolved is just sort of the needs of the community that we're in and what are people looking for. And I think we've started, Encircle really is about encircling every aspect of your life, your mental health,
Yeah.
physical health, your community, um, everything. And so
Yeah.
we've always had that philosophy, but I think we're focusing a lot on the mind body connection and bringing
Sure.
that in a little bit more into our practice, so it's more sort of
Holistic.
holistic and
Yeah. And I love the name because it's interesting. I mean, and you might have this on your website, but when I think of Encircle, I mean, first of all, I think of it as like it's a very welcoming kind of shape, I guess, right? Because when you look at squares, they're very angular or rectangle or triangles, but circles are very comforting and when we're kids, we gather in circles, and
Yeah.
it's more of like a nurturing construct. And then also when we talk about holistic, it's not just about one specific item. It's like a broad toolkit of how you manage your mental health, right? It's not, and that's, Shelly and I in our practice, it's all about not just compartmentalized approach where it's like, okay, I have diabetes or I have a knee disorder. It's
Mhm.
really about getting to the root of the problem and finding ways to optimize, like you said, the mind body health. And that kind of leads me to my next question, because obviously looking at the calendar, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, right?
Yeah.
There's literally coming out of the woodwork, there's no shortage of discussion about strategies for managing our mental health. When I think about it, like I think like medication and cognitive behavioral therapy, those are what I would consider table stakes in
Mhm.
managing mental health. Those are really the bare minimum components. In your experience, like what are some other elements of what I would call like a well balanced, healthy, like mental healthy diet? What are the five basic food groups, I guess you could say?
No, I like that. I like that sort of takeaway for people to keep these things in mind and manage their wellness in this sense. Some of them we've already heard. We keep
Yeah.
hearing it. And we keep hearing it for a reason. Everyone's saying you should exercise.
Hmm.
Yeah, getting up and moving is very important. And I'm not saying, get on the treadmill for 45 minutes and do that 4 or 5 times a week. It could be a 30-minute stroll around the neighborhood. It's just
Yeah.
don't be sedentary, right? Get up and move your body because your endorphins start to move and you start to
Yep.
feel better. I think, when we're sitting too long, we're sort of like, okay, I can't do this anymore. Your body's
Yeah.
telling you get up and move because that's what you need. So I think
Hmm.
making sure that we're exercising in that sense and moving our bodies helps. Of course, things like nutrition, it does affect your mood. I think we've all
Yeah,
noticed
definitely.
there are some things that you eat and you put in your body and you kind of feel sluggish. And there are
Sure.
other things that really just give you a lot of energy. And of course, we can indulge. We're human. We should be enjoying these things, but just on a regular basis, making sure that you're having those nutrients because it does affect your mood. Um,
Yep.
a big one that I think that our society skips over sometimes is sleep. You know,
Hmm. Definitely.
we praise people who are like, oh, I slept for 5 hours and then I got up and I worked out and I went to work.
Yeah. It's like a badge of honor,
Yeah,
right?
it's sort of this badge of honor that we're all wearing. And after time, you start to realize you're physically exhausted, you're emotionally exhausted. And when you're not getting enough sleep, at some point, especially days on end, "Oh,
Hmm.
this project, I have to work on this project, I can't stop. You become delusional at some point. You need
Yeah.
sleep.
Yeah.
You have to sleep.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be more protective of our sleep and making sure we're resting because it does affect how we're feeling
Hmm.
emotionally.
Yeah.
I think support is an important one, whether it's family,
Definitely.
whether it's friends, whether it's your therapist, or a coworker, somebody, life is not easy. It can be a lot of fun, but it takes a lot of work and sometimes we're struggling and it makes life a lot easier to get through when you have that support. So, for people who don't
Definitely.
have support that's another reason to go find a therapist is that's what we're there for.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
um,
and I mean you hit it on the head because I mean in my personal experiences, you and I have talked about. I mean, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and sleep was to you hit it on the head because I was thinking about, especially in the Indian community, um, from our parents' generation. They did their residency. There's always these tall tales of like, I was doing residency. I was curing cancer at the same time. I was still making khichdi for the whole family, and it's like, what do you have to complain about? And so I sort of inherited that mindset where it's like sleep is for the weak. Your decision making is really compromised
yeah,
and your irritability is heightened. So obviously that's going to impact your relationships, and you're making bad choices. You're sleeping poorly. And so what do you do to try to compensate? Well, you guzzle coffee, or
right.
you grab that Snickers bar, whatever it is. And then it's this perfect storm. Like I said, with Mental Health Awareness Month, it's something we all talk about, but I'm guilty of this as well. I mean, it's something that we really struggle to put into practice.
Right. I mean,
Um,
I think, yeah, that like you're saying, these foundations. I think another big one that we sort of overlook because we feel like we don't have time is
mhm.
stopping, slowing down, and being in the calm. I
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
busy lives with work and with, COVID restrictions lifting, people are now socializing, and we're always like, well, I've got this going on. I've got this. I've got to go this. And if if we don't stop, then our bodies are like said, agitated or we're
Sure.
anxious, and our minds are constantly going, and you feel unsettled. And so I think it's important to make it a daily practice. 30 minutes of calm. I'm calling it
Yeah.
quiet. Yoga or reading a book or sitting quietly listening to soothing music, something. Making
Hmm.
just being mindful, even if, I think the best time too sometimes is at the end of the day before you go to sleep. But any time of day, it's important when you're starting to feel your body is getting agitated or anxious. It's time to take
Hmm.
a break.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting because in the U.S., like I said, it's always that hustle culture, and sometimes I think we could learn a lot from other cultures, like especially in Spain, they have like this. They still have the siesta. Like
Right.
Shelley, she used to work at Accenture, and she had a team that was in Madrid, and literally every day at 2, they were like unavailable because they had, the siesta time, and it's just, you just think about all the implications, like how much less conflict there would be, when people are poorly rested, they tend to make mountains out of molehills,
Yeah.
or they're not paying attention. I mean, it's just amazing, the to your point, the power of pause. You mentioned the word calm, and I want to talk about that a little bit, because there is actually an app called
Right.
Calm, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There's apps like Calm, there's apps like Headspace.
Mhm.
um, and it's so interesting because I think technology can really help in this regard because of those apps like Calm. And then the other thing is the power of community. Like, there's a
Mhm.
lot of times where you'll come across a YouTube video, you'll come across some idea that resonates with you, and it's not like when we were growing up, where how would you reach out to somebody in Mumbai to get on a podcast? First of all, that didn't exist back then.
No, you had to make
Um,
a trunk call.
yeah, you had to do the 2 a.m. call, and like, like, hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me? But I'm just bringing that up because it's such a double-edged sword, because I'm bringing that specific example up because, through social media, I was able to connect with somebody who started a platform and a community for people with bipolar disorder in India. It's a gentleman named Vijay Nalawala. I interviewed him a couple months ago, and he started Bipolar India.
Yeah,
So I mean, I personally, just the potential is just incredible, and that's really why we launched this podcast, was to help bring those voices to the forefront. The flip side of that is there's doom scrolling. It's like a slow drip, right? You just sit there and you absorb all these horrific events in in Ukraine, and things about COVID. And then also there's the whole FOMO thing, right? Where you're looking at people's
mhm.
stories about their trips to Aruba, or making partner at their firm. What's your thought about social media? I mean, in terms of like what you're seeing with clients, and maybe how are you advising them, I guess, in how to position technology within their mental health regimen?
It's interesting. A lot of people get it. They get that social media can really bring you down, and
Yeah.
that, but they have a really hard time not getting
Hmm.
off social media. And so it's sort of like there's that awareness, like that's the
Yeah.
first step. But then it's always there, and it's the FOMO, and people can't stop.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can say take a social media break, and people I think get even more anxious because they're like, well, what am I
Yeah.
missing now? What did I miss? What's going on? And sometimes I wonder if it's more about filling your Instagram feed with something that is so benign, or something that is uplifting,
Yeah.
something that is going to take you away from all these negative things that start to come up when you're feeling like I'm missing out on something, or I'm not doing as well as they. How did I do that? And you're happy for
Right.
other people, but then you're also sort of it brings you down like I'm not good enough. I can't. Why can't I do what they're doing? So sometimes it's sort of like, okay, you're not going to stop looking. We can't make you stop looking, and you're just getting more anxious about it. Maybe we do fill your feed with things that are going to be more uplifting.
I was talking to Shelly the other day. I'm like, wouldn't it be nice to go back 20 years, before we had all this stuff, when accessing technology, like getting on AOL was like such an amazing thing. Remember, like you'd spend like 5 minutes and you finally hear that connection sound and then you've got mail, and it was like this, amazing event. Whereas, now it's too much of a good thing. But what I try to do is just maintain the perspective that there's so much more information. And I think if we're thoughtful about it, if we really take a measured approach, maybe restrict our time, then it can be effective. It's like anything. It's like we were talking about earlier, sugar or alcohol or what have you.
A lot of
Um,
people do use it because they need a break. That's their calm. It's sort of,
yeah,
I need to take a break from all of these things that are going on. Let me just mindlessly scroll. But to pay attention to how you're feeling when you're scrolling. Are you
yeah.
are you really feeling more relaxed, or are you starting to get a little anxious? And like you said,
hmm
finding things that are going to be more helpful than hurtful.
Yeah, I mean, for Aaliyah, for my daughter, it's been great because for her art, I think she's been able to reach out to people all over the country, and she's actually been able to sell some of her artwork. And I'm, knock on wood, I'm very grateful that I think she's probably got a healthier perspective on social media than I do. Like she'll post stuff and she doesn't care about likes or comments or whatever. It's just sort of like it's something that's it's a nice to have. So that's all Shelly. That has nothing to do with me. So
No,
um,
yeah,
I
Leah
take
really,
some credit, but
yeah.
um, I wanted to talk to you also about like the cultural aspect because obviously you and I are South Asians. We come from a pretty well accomplished demographic, high achieving, but obviously that introduces challenges. As a therapist, like how has culture played into maybe the services you provide? Is your client base pretty diverse, or are there a lot of people that your cultural background has helped you forge a deeper connection with, or maybe you're more cognizant of the issues you might face? So, maybe talk to me a little bit about sort of how culture has played into uh, your practice at Encircle. And then also, this is a pretty broad question. We could probably spend a whole other episode on this,
Mhm.
but maybe your thoughts about South Asian mental health, the status of that at the current time.
I think this is a really important question about culture, because it is incredibly important. And I'm not talking about just culture, meaning, ethnicity. It's
hmm
also, different. There, we all are part of some other different kind of culture. Like you said, we come from a community of very successful parents are very successful. That's another community that we're a part of, and that's
Right.
its own culture. And so we very much focus on that person's culture, whatever that might mean to them. I do have, when South Asians reach out, they are specifically asking for me. They don't want to see somebody else because they do want somebody who understands, and they don't
Yeah.
have to explain the different aspects of it because we just get it. And I think
hmm
that's important. But I also think it's important if you don't understand the culture as a therapist, it's our job to figure out, understand the culture, learn about it, and ask people about their experience with it because it does shape who we are. It
Yeah.
impacts the decisions that we make. Like I said, I go off to college and I'm like, I'm South Asian. And in this country, my parents are professionals. That's what I'm supposed to do, right? And so
Right.
that really made an impact on my life. So I feel like it's important to look at the person's culture and understand it. Um, I think in the South Asian culture, I think we've all experienced growing up. It was sort of like if you're struggling with something, you go to a family member and you go to the
Yep.
elders in the community because they can help you. And while yes, they are wise, they've had many experiences, but they don't always have the answers.
hmm
So it
And
was
they're biased. I mean, think about it, right? Because and this is related to my experience. I mean, my dad was a psychiatrist. My mom, we never got an official diagnosis, but a lot of the behaviors that she was showing were indicative of bipolar disorder. And people always ask me, they say, "Wow, your dad was a psychiatrist and he wasn't able to see it." And there's that detachment, right? Because it's like you're seeing people with problems all day. The last thing you want to do is come home and you try to think of it as a safe space. You don't want to think about that it lives at home, right? So but that's my own particular experience. But to your point, I mean, when families come together, there's that, especially in the South Asian, it's all cultures, but I found especially in South Asian, community, it's this almost this sense of shame. And it's almost like this, if my son has it or if my wife has it, what does that say about me? And also, what are the people at the temple going to think, So I
Exactly.
don't know. Do you feel like that's gotten better, or do you think that's still pretty predominant?
I think it still exists, unfortunately. I do think it's gotten better. But,
Yeah.
we're dealing with our parents' generation. They come from this mindset. And, so that's that a lot of our kids worry about that, right? We worry about how are they going to think about this? And, I think a lot of our parents have evolved, a lot of the community has evolved and has a better understanding. But there is still that stigma. And I
Yeah.
think we still struggle with it in our community, and it does impact people. And sometimes I hear these stories and I'm like, are we back in the 80s? And are we
Yeah.
still thinking this way? But it's still happening, and it's heartbreaking to hear that it's still happening in our community.
Hmm.
I was gonna say, like, what you and Shelly are doing, it's amazing. It's exactly what our community needs, is to hear these stories and understand that you okay, you struggle with bipolar. There's nothing wrong with you. This is
Yeah.
something that can be managed, and, we've known each other for a very long time, and
Yep.
there's a lot of incredible aspects of you that people could overlook because you've got this label.
Hmm.
"Oh, he's bipolar. Oh, that means certain things that are, he can't be successful, he can't think,
Right.
all these negative things. And it's like, no, that's not who you are at all.
Yeah.
So that's why it's
Yeah.
heartbreaking to hear these stories.
Yeah, and I mean, support has been vital to that. It's not just support, but it's also taking. I always like to call it like the Marie Kondo approach to your relationships. You can be the type of person, and I'll be straight up here. I mean, this is how my parents are, where it's just like their happiness is really determined by the number of people in their circle. Where it's just about how many people did I talk to at the temple, or how many people did we go on that last vacation with?
Right.
And I've taken a contrarian view where it's just like, if there's people in my relationships and my circle that are not constructive or not healthy influences, then if they really don't serve me, then there's no purpose in going along to get along. And so, obviously our circle has shrunk a little bit, but at the end of the day, I mean, we're spending more time with our kids, more quality time, and not just getting after them for not making varsity tennis, or which is what a lot of these conversations really are about. And it's so funny you say that. It's like it does feel like we're back in the 80s a lot of times. You
Right.
would think that we would have learned from a lot of the failings of our parents. They did a lot of great things, but a lot of the things that affected us, that we know it did, and a lot of people are still doing that with their kids. I mean, do you find that's happening,
Oh,
like where they're doing a lot of, yeah.
absolutely. They're bragging about how advanced their child is in XYZ. And it's like when they're thinking about, schools and thinking about, our my child is she's in first grade. And,
Yeah.
if there are people in the community who are looking at the graduating class and saying, well, how many of them are going to an Ivy League school? I'm like,
And she's in first grade.
oh, who cares?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, what do they want to do? And how do we help them succeed in what they want to do? They don't need to go to an Ivy League school to do the
Yeah.
profession that they want to do. And it's sort of like, but they're so young, and there's already that pressure and the competition, and it's it's unhealthy. So I do
Hmm.
like what you're saying, is you shrink down your community to people that are going to be beneficial and who are going to be like-minded and share the same values, because then you start to see your quality of life is better. You're
Yeah.
happier, you're feeling lighter, you're feeling more connected to the people that you're surrounding yourself with.
When I think of my kids and I compare like because we have two in high school, and I think about their experience versus what I was going through. I remember in high school, my main focus was how many parties am I going to, or how many friends do I have in my circle, or stupid things like, you remember our yearbook, putting together like how many pictures do I have on my senior page, that ridiculous stuff. And my kids like couldn't care less about that,
Right.
like
Just
it'd be so easy for them to look at other people's Facebook pages or Instagram posts. And my daughter would rather watch Caillou. No, I'm drawing a blank. It's not Caillou.
mhm,
Some cartoon with our 8-year-old son. And I mean, I feel that's a win. I feel that
right.
not sort of imposing this template of what success looks like, what social and career success looks like, where it's something it's more sustainable.
It's
So,
interesting because you're talking about back in the day when we were in high school, and how many
mhm,
friends you had and your parents, and how many people did we hang out and talk to at the temple and all that. It's the same
yeah,
today with social media. How many likes do I have? It's not stopped. It continues to happen, and so we have to.
it's just in a different form. Yeah,
So we have to be a part of helping our kids, the next generation, understand that it's not about the likes. It's not about the quantity. It's the quality, right?
definitely. Yeah. I wanted to turn it over to you actually, because I think you had some questions for me, and I'd love to answer them if you're game.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being South Asian and also sort of like you said, sort of growing up in this community where, we don't talk about our struggles. We just kind of keep showing, putting our best self forward. I'm curious, what prompted you to sort of decide, I want to go to therapy?
So as I mentioned before, and as you know, I mean, my father was a psychiatrist, and so you would think that with that in the blood, you would think that I would have this natural inclination towards seeking mental help, but it was I got to be honest. I mean, I had not a very good relationship with therapy growing up because every time, and you remember, obviously, I was I got in my share of trouble in high school, and I would have to go to the therapist, and a lot of it was just
Punishment.
I really felt that a lot of it was, did your dad not take you to a baseball game or a Mud Hens game, or did your mom not give you a pat on the back for that 100% on the biology test or whatever. So I honestly, growing up, I did not have a very good view of therapy, and it's also because it was positioned as this corrective or punitive response to a bad action.
Right.
Like I would get in trouble, like I would. Those records are sealed. We won't go into that, but I would get into like trouble for something, and I would always have to go talk to someone, and then the teachers would say, "Is everything okay at home?" So it was almost like this conditioned response where therapy was seen as this almost like detention. So I really had a very dim view of therapy for a long time. What was interesting was, and we talk about this in the book, is that in business school, so this was like in around 2009 or so, I was going to a very competitive business school, University of Chicago. I was working a full-time job, managing a team in India, and we just had our second kid. So I had a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old. And what's interesting is we talked to both sets of parents. Shelly's parents had a little bit less of a enlightened view of therapy. I'll be quite honest. And a lot of times it was always like, just got to have a positive attitude. Just walk it off. Kind of like, that was because that was what they did in their day. They didn't really have the luxury of the tools that we have and that awareness. But my dad, being a psychiatrist, they were actually looking at it as depression, which is, as you know, I mean, that's like taking a match and putting it on, dumping some gasoline on a pile of logs and lighting it, because there was the way it was being addressed was with antidepressants. So without a mood stabilizer, that just took a bad situation, made it explosive. So that really, I would say, between like for 5 years or so, that was a very destructive time because the condition was being treated with medication that would only make it worse. And then I think this, it's funny. I think initially when we talked about having this discussion, it was about finding the right therapist, and that kind of segues into that. The problem was I did not have a good therapist at the time. A therapist is not your cheerleader. A therapist is not your groupie. A therapist is somebody who is supposed to shine a mirror onto you and basically give an objective view about what's going on. Granted, there's limitations because they're only with you for an hour or maybe more if you have multiple sessions in a week. But the problem was when you're in a manic state, I mean, it was really the Nikhil show 24/7, right? So I'm really talking about speaking at conferences, or I'm talking about some deal I just signed, or just headlight grabbing stuff. But I'm not talking about the fact that I have no relationship with my kids because I'm constantly on my phone, or I'm not talking about how I'm not attending to my wife's needs, being a mother at home taking care of two kids. I'm tuning all that out because of a lot of the symptoms of bipolar disorder. I firsthand witnessed the real negative impact of having, for shorthand, really to just call it a bad therapist, someone who is not presenting like a second opinion, or who's not seeking the input of your loved ones,
Right.
seeking the input of just seeing what's in front of them. And it's almost like, munching popcorn and watching the drama unfold. So,
Exactly. That's not nowhere near
yeah,
being helpful. But
yeah,
you're right. You need a therapist who's going to challenge you. And I'm not saying
yeah,
like in a harsh way, like kind of nudging you a bit and helping you. I get where, sometimes it takes time. People can't get there right away. And so we
right.
are patient with that. But we can't stop challenging you to get to that different place and kind of seeing other things that might be going on. Right.
Yep.
So yeah, a therapist that's kind of sitting there munching on their popcorn, like, yeah, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
You're the best.
It's almost like they're watching a reality show, like
Right.
up in person.
It's not helpful, and it was detrimental for you. I do think it's important to shop around.
Hmm.
Call a bunch of therapists. We always, most of us, if not all of us, offer at least a 15-minute free consultation. So you can talk to that person to get a feel for what their style is and get a
Hmm.
feel for how they work and ask some questions. Um, but I know this is a big part of your story too, is getting input from other people. Um,
Definitely.
because we can only work with what is people are coming into therapy presenting with. And
Yeah.
so if we don't have the full picture, we can't then do the best job that we can do. I mean, I sort of along this idea of somebody having bipolar and that being missed, there's a teenager that I was working with who legitimately she has ADHD. She did something impulsive and she didn't
Hmm.
tell me about it because she didn't think anything of it. And then I
Hmm.
spoke with her mom because I am in contact when I work with children and adolescents. I'm always in contact with the parents. And the mom's like, oh, yeah, she did XYZ. And I was like, we put it in context and you realize this could be signs of early bipolar disorder. There's bipolar in the family. She,
Yeah.
the teenager's not telling me this. The mother's telling me this. And the behavior that was exhibited, we have to be able to tease apart what's going on. If I didn't have that information from the mother,
Right.
I wouldn't have known about this behavior, but even if she mentioned it to me, I'd be like, okay, what's impulsive? It's ADHD, and write it
Hmm.
off as something that it's not. And so it is incredibly important to get other information.
I mean, what's crazy about my situation? I mean, I had to go into inpatient hospitalization, and at that point, I was really at rock bottom because I'd lost my job. I had, I'd filed for divorce. We were really, I was no joke. I mean, almost at death's door, and the therapist actually, with the input that I was presenting, and I wasn't being deceitful or anything. I was just telling him how I felt.
Right.
They actually almost diagnosed it as depression. And it was actually like, had I been on my own, basically this would have been starting the clock over at zero, where basically, we're just basically repeating history over and over. So that, getting Shelley's input, just giving the context, I think is what was able to turn things around and prevent, the cycle of dysfunction and misery from repeating itself. So
But yeah, and
yeah.
I'm sure this is addressed in the book, but I mean, yeah, Shelley was amazing.
Hmm.
She didn't stop. She was very persistent. I have information to share. I have information to share. And
Right.
from what what she was saying is people were not listening to her. And and rightfully so. Like, somebody can't, we can't say, yes, we work with this person. But I did tell her, find out who a psychiatrist is and send them the information. I know you can't confirm or deny that this person is a patient of yours, but if they are, here's some information. Um,
Right.
I know that your therapist kind of sounds like wasn't necessarily listening to what Shelley had to say, but kudos to her for being persistent because it did help. It saved your life.
Yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
now there's that other information that's incredibly important and it helps get you to give the right diagnosis. And now
Hmm.
you're able to live the life that you've always been wanting to live, right? And you guys are doing great.
Yeah.
I do think it's important to hear from, and people are like, is that weird if my mom, they're in their 20s, if my mom comes to a session? I'm like, no, bring her.
Mhm.
I want to hear what she has to say.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, in your experience, have you seen similar instances like that where you're on one track in terms of the how, you're devising a treatment plan, and then you get more information and that can adjust. You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I'm curious, like, do you see that a lot where then you bring in the parents or the sibling or whatever for context? Does that tend to change the trajectory?
It can, especially in this case. It was sort of like we need to keep an eye on this and see if
Hmm.
this develops more or if it was something else. I do think it's incredibly important because it can change the information. It can change how we work with this person. The unfortunate thing is, with adults, we don't get other information. We just get what they have to say. And,
Hmm.
there are times that people come in and they're talking about their significant other, and I'm like, you're welcome to bring them in for a session,
Yeah.
or I am happy to meet with them to hear what they have to say because it helps give that a different perspective. You're sitting there on the couch, you're talking about all these things, and your significant other comes in and you're like, they're putting themselves down, but their spouse sees them a different way.
Sure.
And then it helps you realize, like, what are we working with here? And so I'm always happy to hear from other people in that person's life.
Yeah.
We can only work with what comes into the room and what is being presented.
And I'm sure it's a slippery slope, right? Because as with your clients, you obviously want to maintain confidentiality. You want them to feel that they feel secure sharing information with you. But a lot of times, you're working with a limited view of the patient or the client, and that's actually what I talked about with a friend of mine on one of our previous episodes. He developed an app where therapists can actually, it's an SMS based app where a patient's family or friends or peers can basically provide input to the therapist in like it's an app
Great. Yeah.
that I think would be really, would be super helpful to give the full 360-degree view.
Yeah.
Um,
As a therapist, we tease apart the information and we kind of put the pieces back together and figure out, what's going on. Like, sometimes you do have people who are afraid that their sibling might say something or their spouse might say something that they don't really want to talk about it, right?
mhm.
Because once you say it out loud, then you have to deal with it. And so I could see why people get nervous about it. But like you said, you need to be challenged, right? You can't just sit and have it be the Nikhil show all the time. It's just like I need
Right.
somebody to challenge me. And it's unfortunate with adults. We don't get other information. With children and adolescents, we have to get consent from the guardian or the parent, and then
Mhm.
I'm always in touch with them, and I ask them to be a part of sharing information. And so it's different with children and adolescents because the parent is involved. With adults, other adults are not necessarily involved. But
Right.
I love this idea of this app where you can share information. Um,
Yeah,
it
definitely.
said the 360 view here.
I guess another question, obviously both you and I are South Asian, and meditation and mindfulness I know are becoming really big, very mainstream. Are you adopting any of those Eastern principles into your practice, like in terms of advising your clients to try some meditation or any other Eastern philosophies that maybe aren't as quote unquote mainstream?
I guess they try not to use the word meditation. I feel like it's become a buzzword, and
Yeah.
people now are kind of rolling their eyes at, okay, yeah, I heard this before. And I think that's why I'm using a different language. Maybe it's calm, quiet, downtime. But it's that same idea of sitting with quiet and sitting, sometimes it's sitting with your thoughts. Sometimes people can't handle sitting with themselves. So
Yeah.
I say maybe yoga because it's a practice that does help calm your body, helps you calm your mind. So I think we are incorporating it, but trying not to use buzzwords that are getting people to sort of be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, I heard that before." Meditation is centuries old,
Yeah.
and it's stuck around for a reason, right? And so I think
Hmm.
we have to honor that and again, we're in such busy lives that we're like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time. I don't have time. And so we have to, 30 minutes. You can make that
Yeah.
time. If I go to pick up my daughter from school, I will leave 20 minutes ahead of time so I can sit in the car quietly without,
Yeah.
music, without somebody trying to get a hold of me for something, and it's my quiet time.
Right.
That's how I incorporate it. So I do it a little bit different. It's not necessarily
Yeah.
somebody.
Yeah. The Calm app I found is really good. I mean, there's one guy, Jay Shetty. I don't know if you've
Oh, yeah,
listened to
yeah.
him.
Great. Yeah.
First of all, he's our generation.
Right.
Second of all, I think it's more, I guess, real world oriented because he's actually worked in the corporate world, and he's also been a monk. So it's a very interesting
Oh,
combination of perspectives. I guess I wanted to make sure I know because I think you had some other things you wanted to ask me. I wanted to make sure we got to them as well.
yeah. I mean, I guess I was curious just a little bit about, you kind of touched on it, but your experience sitting with your therapist because you stayed with her for a while. And so I guess I was wondering what your experience was. I know when you're in a manic state, it's sort of like,
Oh,
oh,
at the time.
yeah, but I'm wondering, just sitting
Yeah.
with her, like, did you have this sense that something was off? Because I think, our gut's never going to steer us wrong. And if you're sitting in the room with somebody and you're feeling uneasy, you know,
Yeah.
it's time to sort of think, like, is this the right fit for me? So that's what I was.
That's a great question. I never stopped to think about that. But to your point about, the gut's never going to steer us wrong, the manic gut is a very different animal
Yeah.
because the manic gut is always seeking validation, and it's always any view to the contrary is really looked down upon. This is right after I finished my MBA. I'm talking about going to get my JD, or I'm talking about starting a company, or buying a spot, just all kinds of grandiose visions. And you know people rightfully are, people who are in my corner, like Shelly or her parents, or even my parents at the time, saying, "Whoa, slow down there, Tiger. That's
Right,
you might be biting off more than you can chew."
right.
Then you have a therapist who's saying, "Whoa, that's great. Pat on the back to you, and I think you're doing great." It really was. It was I don't want to say self fulfilling prophecy, but I guess it kind of was because you're seeking that validation, and if you've got somebody patting you on the back who's taking you down a bad road, then that's going to resonate with you more, and that can be very destructive. I got to believe there are therapists who go into this profession for the wrong reason. It's like they want to be the hero, where it's like patients are coming to them with a problem, and this is what I saw a lot early on in my experience with therapy, where it's like I'd go and I'd be like, well, I'm not doing well in classes, or there's stuff that's like in the here and now. And always, 9 times out of 10, it was always, well, how did your parents make you feel about that?
Mm.
Um, so there was that desire to be the hero, right? There was that desire to uh, be a solution in search of a problem. So that I would say, to your point, to your question earlier about how did it feel when I was manic, to have that. I mean, again, shorthand, just call it a bad therapist. It was the highlight of the week because it was almost like I said, it was the Nikhil show and having like a one man audience. It was not like nothing else.
Well, how did you find her? I'm curious how you found your therapist for this
I
first time.
mean, I think it was just, I had switched jobs and I was looking on, what therapists were covered by my insurance, and she popped up. And I, this is something I do have to say is that degrees are not the be all end all,
No.
and I got to be honest, I was a little bit of a snob because I saw there were like probably 5 or 6, and I think in terms of location, but also the fact that she was the only one with the PsyD,
Right.
um, because there were other ones with like an MA, CP, what is it, L,
CP.
the acronyms. And I have a therapist right now. She has an MA and an LCPC, and she's phenomenal. You know,
Yeah.
um, and I think that's something I do want to bring up also is just that people need to check their ego at the door. They need to. And I had another psychiatrist who I think had trained at Columbia, or was it Northwestern, but she was the worst therapist of all time also, because it was like she, much like this other therapist, she was always when I was coming to her with all my problems, I wasn't sleeping. I was indulging in really bad behaviors. And her response was, there's nothing wrong with you. The only thing is, you have a crazy family. No joke. This is literally what she said.
Oh my God.
And there was always that sort of instinctual, there was always this, I would always look at her degree as a reflection of her competence as a therapist when in fact it was the worst. So yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing when people are looking for the right therapist, they need to not just look at the ratings, not just look at that. That can be important. Not just look at the degree or where they went to school,
Right.
but is it a right fit? And so I think it's great that you have like a screening process. It's a two-way street. You're assessing them and they're assessing you
Right.
to make sure that
Well,
it's the
that's
right
why they
fit.
wrap around, right? Because
Yeah,
it's just, talking to that person, you can tell whether or not that's somebody you need to be able to be your authentic self
exactly.
being with that
Yeah,
person. And if you
yeah.
can't pick that up in the first 15 minutes of talking to them, it's not the right person for you, right?
Has it been the other way around where you've had instances where someone might come to you and for you're for whatever reason you can't, you're like, I can't help you, or it's not a fit?
We do the same thing. Sometimes we
Hmm.
feel, and it could be whatever they're, maybe they're coming in with something that we struggle with ourselves. And so we know we're going to be biased. We can't be unbiased.
Sure.
And so I think that's good practice to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. It could be a cultural thing, seeing if you feel comfortable talking with this person about their culture or their political views or, something like that.
Right.
Right. So for us too, there are times where we don't feel like we're the best fit because we can't help them in a way that they would like help. And so it's not fair for us to say, well, okay, well, if you're going to pay me, I'll see you. That's not how it should be working. It should be,
Hmm.
can I help this person? And if I feel like I can help them, then yes, let's do this. But if I feel like I'm not skilled in being able to help them with what they're coming in for, then
Right.
we refer them to
Right.
somebody to help them.
This has been such a great discussion, Monica. It's so nice to hear your insights. And I know we talk about a lot of other things offline, but it's great to talk about an issue that's so important. And I think what I always say is, it's these discussions that'll really help shatter the stigma, and I think give people with our profile, whether they're in the South Asian community or professionals, it'll give them a little bit of a different insight into what they're facing, and just give them a little bit clearer path really towards mental well-being. It's a never-ending journey, really. It's not something that you can put a stake in the ground and say, hey, I've found mental wellness. And that's kind of going back, I'm sure this ties into the Encircle philosophy, right, where it's a circular thing. It's just never a fixed point in time. So I
Right.
really do appreciate it.
You got the analogy. You get it. But yeah, it is important to kind of continue with the mental health. I mean, there's so many people over the years, they've, sort of come in, they've had this issue that they wanted to sort of work through. They work through it, and then something else comes up. And so years later, they're like, hey, can I come back and want to talk to you a little bit about this? So it's nice to have that touch point. When you
Yeah.
find somebody you can connect with, and then over the years, there are people that will, I haven't heard from for 3 years, and then I'll come back and be like, hey, this big thing happened. Do you have space? I'm like, of course I'll come, come see me. I'd love
Yeah.
to see you.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that you've sort of alluded to, but that we didn't really kind of dive into, but I did want to touch upon is, I think you said like you go to therapy and somebody's like, your family's a mess. That's why you're struggling. That's why you have these
Yeah.
problems. And you know, I um, I do think it's important that we do get that childhood history from people
Hmm.
because it's it does shape who we are, and we don't need to stay there. But I think it's helpful to have that information because
Definitely.
it does impact us. I mean, there are times that people will come in and say, they're sitting in a meeting and at work, and they're trying to share some ideas, and nobody's listening to them. And then you're like, oh well, it's kind of like how you grew up. You're the sixth child, and everybody else had a chance to sort of find their voice, and they're all
Right.
your siblings are louder than you, and so of course I can see you getting triggered sitting in this meeting. And so we don't stay there. We touch upon
Yeah.
it, and they're like, "Oh, that makes sense." And we definitely, I definitely get that childhood history, and when I talk
Hmm.
young adult history, and family history, relationship history, because they do. affect us and
Yeah.
stay with us. And it's just to give it's because it helps us see what's happening today. Why are we getting triggered? How did that experience impact you? Like I said, we don't stay there, but
Yeah. It
we
gives you the context.
it gives us a
Because we
context.
don't these problems don't exist in a vacuum, right?
Exactly. So, I think sometimes people are like, why are we talking about this? And they want to rush. We're in a culture where everything's immediate, and they kind of want to rush to the end. And sort of like, well, there's a process here, and we need this information. It could help us. And when they're able to give that information, then you can make that connection for them. They're like, oh, this makes sense, and then they're better able to decide, okay, well, what techniques are going to work for me, and then you start
Definitely.
to see the change, you start to see the progress, and they're like, this feels better. It just feels so much
Yep.
better to be able to know which direction to go in.
Was there anything else you wanted to maybe go back and elaborate on? If there's anything else you wanted to cover
Well,
before
I
we
think
wrap up?
this was a really rich discussion. I'm glad we got a chance to do it. I know we've always talked a lot about things, different, like you said, different topics. So it's nice to sort of get really in depth with some of these things. But I do feel like we covered a lot of this. I think it is important, to find that right therapist. And when we say right therapist, right for you, who's the
Right.
right
It's not
person?
a one size fits all. It's very personalized.
Yeah, and like you said, just because of their degree doesn't matter. It's that again, shop around. Talk to different people, do that free consultation. Let them know what you're looking for. Ask them questions about their style. Allow your family members and your friends to have a conversation. Like, we don't disclose information. It is confidential. But if somebody wants to share something, to share it, because it does help
Hmm.
us better help
Yep.
the person that we're working with. So, and I'm glad that you are able to finally find the right combination for you, because as you can attest to how important it is.
Yeah. No, I consider myself very lucky in a lot of ways. I did want to throw this up here. If people want to get a hold of you, for people listening, but if people are watching this, the website is encirclew.com, Encircle Wellness. And then on Instagram, you're at Encircle Wellness. And you're located where again?
We are in the west. We're kind of like West Loop, Fulton Market, right at Lake and Jefferson, really close to Ogilvy, and um,
Okay,
we are
perfect.
we're in person. We're in person and we're virtual. So
Virtual.
I think we like to see people in person. I feel like it kind of drowns out the noise, right, when you're in the room with that person. But
Definitely.
obviously,
Yep.
virtual has been a great tool as well. So
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks again, Monica. It was really great speaking with you. I'm sure we'll have more of these discussions down the road, and really appreciate all the insight and time you offered.
yeah, and I appreciate you having me and being able to have this discussion with you.